when love is gone, my mother, when love is gone, in our darkest hour hope lingers on.
My Father, when peace is gone, my Father, when peace is gone,
in our darkest hour hope lingers on. I will not hate, and I will not fear, in our darkest hour hope lingers here. My sister, when equality's gone, when equality's gone, in our darkest hour hope lingers on. My brother, with tolerance gone, when tolerance gone, in our darkest hour hope lingers on. I will not hate, and I will not fear, in our darkest hour hope lingers here. I will not hate, and I will not fear, in our darkest hour hope lingers here.
Creator of life and being, we come to you on this evening of celebration of community, as a people called to the ideas of justice, reconciliation, peace, mercy, equity, and love. We are reminded that in the sacred text of your children, in the Quran, the Torah, the Gospels, the teachings of Buddha, and the stories of Hinduism, that we nowhere in those sacred texts are people divided by race. There is no mention of people based on the color of their skin. People were simply described by the region they came from, the city they dwelled in, the families they descended from, or perhaps the most important character, the character of their lives, whether they were people who gave or people who took, people who healed or people who hurt. It wasn't till centuries later, and mostly the fault of my own Christian church, when it joined the forces of colonialism rather than stand up against it. It is then when we see faith divided by race. It is then that we see the white church gain dominion and power and use it not to help, but to hurt and to oppress. We know, Creator, this is not your way. We read it in the words of your prophet Muhammad, who said, "Oh, you who believe, be upright for God and bear witness and justice." In the words of the Jewish prophet Amos, who wrote, "But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." In the words to describe Jesus, he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made all groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall and the hostility between us. And to close, the words of Gandhi, as a reminder that even small groups like us, gathered here in small communities like this, that we can do mighty and extraordinary things. We can do mighty and extraordinary things as a small group of people, because as Gandhi said, if you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping in a room with a mosquito. So let us be pesky mosquitoes this evening, buzzing loudly the banner of justice, of equity and equality, of peace and hope, and most importantly, let us be gathered together in the embodiment of love.
This book is called Pink is for Boys by Rob Perlman. Pink is for boys and girls, and bows and fancy clothes. Blue is for girls and boys, and uniforms on a team. Yellow is for boys and girls, and a crown to wear. Green is for girls and boys, and grass to run on. Red is for boys and girls, and cars racing along the track. Orange is for girls and boys, and popsicles dribbling down sticky chins. Purple is for boys and girls, and unicorns like me. And unicorns, and unicorns, because freaking unicorns! Brown is for girls and boys, and teddy bears to cuddle. Black and white are for boys and girls, and puppies and kittens to pet. All of the colors are for everyone, girls and boys, and unicorns, and flowers and butterflies and rainbows in the sky. Thank you. And if you didn't know it, back in the day, pink used to be for guys, for boys, and baby blue was for girls. And at some point in the 20s or 30s or thereabouts, somehow they got flip-flopped around. And now, pink doesn't go for boys for whatever reason, but that's just kind of silly, to be honest.
The work of racial justice and education is personal and collective. I grew up attending Rutland High School and graduated in 2004 with a colorblind, post-racial view of the world. I truly believe that racism was a thing of the past. That's what I learned in school. It took and continues to take years of unlearning to actually see the reality of systemic racism and its implications in all aspects of life. And finally, it's really exciting to see many Vermont educators speaking out and bravely teaching the truth. And we just want to share that the Education Justice Coalition stands firmly behind students, caregivers, and educators fighting to teach the truth. Teaching the truth about race and racism will build empathy and understanding. It is a practice towards unity and collective liberation. As attacks on the critical race theory boogeyman sweep across Vermont, we are ready to take a strong stance for teaching about race, for teaching the truth of our history, and for moving forward as a society to dismantle systemic racism and other forms of oppression. The attacks on CRT are a reaction to the increased recognition of systemic racism. Race Forward found that the term systemic racism was used more times in the media after the murder of George Floyd than in the last 30 years combined. Boiled down to its essence, CRT simply believes that systemic racism exists and is embedded in all aspects of society. Kudos to all the brave teachers that are having honest conversations about race with their students and making connections between historical and current oppressions and teaching ethnic studies. We must remember that this resistance is a sign that we are making change. The anti-CRT folks push forth a colorblind approach to race. This approach invisibilizes the experience of BIPOC individuals in the same way that I don't see your disability or I don't see you as trans negates the lived reality of difference for these folks. Students deserve to understand the world around them, and we can trust young people to have meaningful discussions about complex topics. Teaching about race and racism unites across difference as we move towards more honestly understanding each other's experience instead of assuming that we just know. Schools can be huge agents of social change, or they can be used to perpetuate the status quo. There is no neutral stance, and we must make an active choice to create schools that will dismantle instead of reinforce oppression. We will be working on asking school district leaders across the state to sign on to a statement and make a firm commitment to an anti-racist education that teaches the truth about racism, encourages youth to be agents of change, and creates culturally sustaining environments for BIPOC youth.
I wanted to talk a little bit today about phrases we hear very often. And for this, I just need one volunteer to come up and stand next to me. Do I have one volunteer? Anyone? Anyone? You want to come up here? Can you stand next to me?
Yes! Woo! Give 1,000 points!
Okay, so who has ever heard the phrase, I don't see color, or I'm colorblind? Who's ever heard that phrase? Who's ever heard someone say that phrase? Right? Okay, so I just want you to stand here. Stand right here. What's your name?
Nora.
What is it?
Nora.
Nora? Okay, so Nora's gonna stand next to me. And I want you to tell me, do we look different? Do we look different? Yeah? What are some differences you see? Height? Yeah? Much shorter than me. You'll grow up, you'll probably be taller than me. How about us? What other differences? Age? Age, yeah? Is age important to you?
Yes.
Would you rather be my age or your age?
Fine.
That's the ignorance of youth talking, folks. But no, I probably would rather be your age too. You don't have to pay taxes, do you? No. How about this? Have you ever heard a phrase, maybe talking to a black person or a brown person, when I see you, I don't see a black person. Or when I see you, I don't see a brown person. Have you ever heard someone say that? Yeah. The problem with that phrase is that, for me, much like for Nora, who I am is important. For Nora, her age is important. It's important to her because it informs the way she approaches the world.
For me, my color is important. My blackness informs the way I approach the world. How about this? You can go back and sit down. Thank you so much. Let's give Nora a round of applause. Thank you so much. How about this phrase? Have you ever heard this phrase? Maybe it's someone talking about race or something and they say, I don't care if you're black, brown, yellow, green with pink spots, yellow with purple polka dots. I see you as a person. Has anyone ever heard that phrase before? Or something similar to it? Yeah. So, how many of you have ever seen a human who was purple with pink stripes? How about yellow with purple polka dots? No one? Because humans don't look like that. So what happens is when people say things like that, when people use phrases like that, what they're doing is they're othering the person. They're saying, I don't see your color, I see you as a human, which is fine. But again, our color is important to people. Your color is important to people. It informs who you are as an identity. And what it also says is that it relates being black, being brown, being yellow, being a person of color, to otherness, to alienness, to something that isn't human. So it's okay. It's okay for us to all look different. It's fine. It's part of who we are. Something we always hear about America is that America's one big melting pot. But I don't like that phrase. It's not a right phrase to use. I think of it as like a salad, right? America's one big salad. Now how many of you, when you make a salad, you take your tomatoes, you take your lettuce, you take your onions, your pecans, your blueberries if you're being adventurous, whatever it is you're putting in, you put all your ingredients in a blender, you turn on the blender, and you serve it in cups. No one eats salad like that. You eat salad by you take your tomatoes, you take your lettuce, you take your onions, your pecans, your dressing, you mix it all into a bowl, and you make a salad. And that's what America should be. That's what we want St. Albans to be. We don't all have to be the same. We don't all have to look the same or act the same or think the same. But one thing we can all agree, and one thing we can all have the sameness in, is that we're all humans, and we're all deserving of the same treatment and the same rights, and ultimately the same grace. And so when you look at your neighbor, maybe they're black, maybe they're Asian, maybe they have a disability, maybe they're gay, maybe they're transgender. You need to look at that person as a human, but you also need to look at them as what they identify as, because that part's important to them. It's important to me. I'm sure who you are is important to you, whether you're, if you're white, maybe you're Italian, Irish, German, French. I happen to be half Norwegian, and that's very important to me. I'm very proud of my Norwegian heritage. So all we want us to do, all we want this society to do, this country to do, and this town to do, is to treat each one of us with respect and dignity while allowing us to be the identity with which we identify. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
My name is Reese Kelly, and I use he, him, his pronouns. And in case if it's a new experience for you to hear people introduce their pronouns, I want you to know that I share mine because, for me, it acknowledges that gender is expansive and sometimes muddy and mostly beautiful. And it is something that is beyond the binary and defies expectations. To not assume what someone's identity is just by looking at them, and an invitation for others to let me know how they'd like to be addressed. It's also a very simple way to foster an inclusive and affirming community, the type of community that I think all of us here today deeply want St. Albans to be. In January of 2019, as I was preparing remarks for a Martin Luther King Jr. event at work, I stumbled upon an article in The Guardian by scholar Robin DiAngelo entitled, "White People Assume Niceness is the Answer to Racial Inequality. It's not." DiAngelo argues that as white people, our strong desire to not be racist often manifests in a superficial, hollow, and saccharine friendliness towards people of color, rather than in actions that disrupt or dismantle racism. This article was a huge wake-up call for me, especially as someone who felt like I had dedicated myself to the struggle for many years. How is it at this age I was finally being awoken to this idea? I began to see the myriad ways that I myself hid behind niceness. How my fear of saying the wrong thing or disrupting social conventions has kept me complicit in maintaining white supremacy and white privilege. See, I was raised to think that being nice is one of the most important characteristics that someone can have, especially if that person is a woman. Being nice meant being civil, agreeable, and generally following cultural norms in social interactions. To me, although it's not synonymous with being polite, that's what comes to my mind first. So things like being taught not to call adults by their first names, but rather Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, or to use Miss, Ma'am, or Sir when addressing strangers, or incessantly saying, excuse me, and I'm sorry. I've observed colleagues, friends, loved ones, and strangers perpetrate racial microaggressions, and I've sat in silence. I've minimized and excused the behavior. I've done nothing. I was polite, I was minding my own business, and I was being nice. Sometimes I've even been next level nice. I've approached that BIPOC person who is victimized in these instances where, remind you, I did nothing, to check in and make sure they were okay after the instance and see if they needed anything from me, the bystander who did nothing. What absolutely bizarre and totally commonplace reaction is that? Let me get some head nods, white people. I know where we're at. It's a very, very white thing to do. So D'Angelo, luckily, gets this totally weird white people behavior, and she says that this type of being nice, like checking in, on my colleague, for example, who just experienced harm and I ignored it, is a way that we manage our own racial anxiety. So the actual feelings in our body of being uncomfortable. So in other words, in these instances, I am alleviating my own discomfort and I am maintaining the status quo, and I am absolutely doing so at the direct expense of BIPOC folks. Even more so, D'Angelo argues that being generally a nice and likable person creates this weird psychosocial loophole for absolution. So if I maintain that I am nice, and I do or say something racist, then I'm convinced, as are other white people, that I didn't mean it. I couldn't have meant it. It was just an accident, so it shouldn't count. It's not a big deal, let's just all move on. Civility, politeness, niceness, all of these things can be weaponized in order to dismiss, silence, and gaslight oppressed and marginalized people. And let's be clear, being nice is very different from being kind. Kindness is having a deep consideration for others. It is regarding their feelings, and it is being aware of the broader context in which they live their lives. It's compassion, it's generosity, it's telling and hearing hard truths. Kindness is radical candor. D'Angelo writes, quote, "If I cannot tell you what it means to be white, I cannot understand what it means not to be white. I will be unable to bear witness to, much less affirm an alternate racial experience. I will lack the critical thinking and skills to navigate racial tensions in constructive ways. This creates a culture in which white people assume that niceness is the answer to racial inequality, and people of color are required to maintain white comfort in order to survive." If we extrapolate from her statements, 1, niceness is not the same thing as being aware of our own identities and privilege. 2, niceness is not the same as developing the skills to navigate cultural differences and tensions. And 3, when we think niceness is the answer to inequality, we demand that oppressed people maintain the comfort of the privileged in order to survive. I find that to be an incredibly powerful premise. If someone were to ask, what does it mean to be white, or how has your life been shaped by race? If I don't have answers to that, my lack of awareness is not benign. My lack of awareness means that I can't fully appreciate or affirm the experiences of BIPOC folks. My lack of awareness means that I will perpetuate racism even if I intend not to. D'Angelo, like most BIPOC people who came before her and after her, because she did not create this idea on her own, suggests that white people start with self-awareness, seeing ourselves as white and exploring how race has shaped our lives. As I critically look at my own family history, I want to share part of my journey with you. So here's an interlude for a brief history lesson. Many years ago, I read the anthology named simply Privilege, a Reader. This includes chapters such as Masculinity is Homophobia, Subverting Racism Within, and my favorite, I think you'll like this too, Why are droves of unqualified and unprepared kids getting into our top colleges? Because their dads are alumni. That really is the name of the chapter. In the chapter in this anthology by Karen Brodkin Sachs entitled How Jews Became White, I learned about one of the most significant affirmative action programs for white people in the United States. I bet you can't guess it. The GI Bill. The GI Bill of Rights, also known as the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, was created to upskill the U.S. labor force and provide immediate rewards to World War II veterans. This included things like preferential hiring and priority in jobs, financial support during the job search, 1 year of unemployment compensation, small loans for starting up businesses, and most importantly, low-interest home loans and educational benefits, which included both tuition and living expenses to attend high school, college, or vocational technical school. After World War II, 8 million GIs took advantage of their educational benefits and caused what scholars argue is the greatest wave of college building in American history. And white male GIs who went to college and technical schools were well positioned after graduation for professional opportunities in high-paid managerial and technical labor. There was a massive wave of economic advancement for World War II vets that transformed the U.S. class structure. The middle class actually expanded to encompass most of the U.S. population, and for the first time in U.S. history, veterans pulled ahead of non-veterans in earning capacity. However, and I'm sure you will not be surprised in me saying this, the economic boom did not benefit everyone. I know you probably can guess what's coming next. Historical evidence shows that the military, the VA, the U.S. Employment Service, and the Federal Housing Administration effectively denied Black GIs access to their benefits and to the new educational, occupational, and residential opportunities. Black soldiers were disproportionately given dishonorable discharges, which denied them veterans' rights and benefits, period. In terms of educational access, Black GIs were denied admission to white colleges. Most of the colleges were white colleges at the time, and many were turned away from Black colleges because of the overcrowding of so many people going to school. While about 20,000 Black veterans attended college during this time period, almost just as many, 15,000, could not gain entry, not just to college, but to white-collar jobs and to the middle class. Sachs also found that for those who went directly into the workforce, the VA and the U.S. Employment Service disproportionately gave less employment information to Black vets and disproportionately offered them low-paid and menial jobs. So that's just education. What about in housing? Some of you people may already know about this. For whites, the post-war period was a booming time for suburbia. Think Levittown, right? At the beginning of World War II, only 1/3 of all U.S. families owned their houses, and within 20 years, that number doubled. Mostly as a result of white families using GI benefits or associated housing systems to gain access to both low-interest loans and access to high-value neighborhoods. Segregation kept Black families out of the suburbs, and redlining made sure they could not buy or repair their homes in neighborhoods where they were allowed to live. For those who have not heard the term redlining, it refers to a system developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s. In the simplest terms, it's a neighborhood rating system. It places the highest value, with the color green, on all white, middle-class neighborhoods, and the lowest value, the red value, on BIPOC, racially diverse, and working-class neighborhoods. As you can assume, high ratings meant high property values. What you may not know is underneath this layer, the idea that low property values in redline neighborhoods, it created them as bad investments for banks. So banks did not want to loan to individuals trying to buy homes in those areas, and they wouldn't insure mortgages. So the FHA and VA's refusal to guarantee loans in redline neighborhoods made it virtually impossible for Black families to borrow money for home improvement or even to purchase a home. This means that housing access for Black vets was limited to low-value homes where they suffered from high interest mortgage rates. if they could get one at all. This, in effect, locked these vets out of the middle class and out of the possibility of building wealth that could be passed down through generations. That means that federal programs that were themselves designed to assist GIs to improve the economy and to upskill the labor force systematically reinforced a white, non-white racial binary and offered significant, lasting, intergenerational economic advantages to white male GIs and their families. So what does this one simple piece of legislation have to do with my family history of whiteness? My maternal grandfather, Lyndon Hall, was drafted into the military in February 1945 and served in the infantry until December 1946 during the occupation of Japan at the end of World War II. Upon returning home, he, like many other white GIs, got a degree, and this one in electrical engineering from Cornell University, and he got it tuition-free. He used the GI Bill to purchase his first home. All of this positioning him well within the middle class. In the 1960s, my grandfather moved his family from New York to an all-white, middle-class neighborhood in Michigan, where his 6 children, my mother included, attended well-funded public schools and went on to earn college degrees. All 6 of them. As the child of 2 college-educated white parents who benefited not only from their own privilege, but also from the intergenerational wealth born of whiteness, I myself left college with no student loans. And in my mid-30s, my parents gave me a down payment for my first home. My personal ability to remain in the middle class is a direct outcome of the benefits my white grandfather received. Benefits that were inequitably funneled to white heterosexual men. And this one example is only a small window into the intergenerational effects of whiteness. I share this because without knowing and acknowledging this history, which by the way, down the street, they're arguing we should not learn about, I might unequivocally believe that my economic situation and my educational attainment were purely a product of my hard work, purely a product of the American dream. I think about my own history now in relationship to niceness. When am I acting in ways that assuage my own discomfort and racial anxiety? And when am I acting in solidarity? Can I answer the question, what does it mean to be white? Today I'm following the suggestion of others to acknowledge and better understand how my life is shaped by race, to explore and take action around reparations, to swap my niceness for kindness where I can, and to interrupt white silence when I witness bigotry. I don't know about all of you, but I want to live in a community where we talk about race and racism, where we recognize that our silence and avoidance gets in the way of us embodying our own values. I share my thoughts with you today as an invitation to be on this path with me, to forge this path together in St. Albans and help me back on the path when I fall astray, because that's what community does. That's the benefit of being together. I'll end with just saying I'm so grateful to be here in St. Albans with you, and I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, where she says, "Do the best you can until you know better, then when you know better, do better."
Thank you, really, I'm so happy to be here. I'm Eliana Castro, I use she, her pronouns. That's my husband and my daughter over there. Today, I'd like to share a few things that I know for myself, that I've learned from experience, and then talk a little bit about how the more we know, the better a community we can build. So the first thing I know is that race is a socially constructed category. What that means is the idea that human beings are part of these defined and distinct categories, these labels that we use now, that was made up. That didn't always exist. It is a pretty new idea, in fact. Even though we move through the world in ways where race matters and it has material, concrete consequences, someone a very long time ago made up these categories in order to create racial hierarchy and to establish a power dynamic that we are still living with today. Race was created to justify the enslavement of African people and to also legitimate the land grab that was settler colonialism, the taking of indigenous people's ancestral lands, people who we oftentimes talk about in the past tense as though they don't exist anymore, but they do. And so we're still grappling with what settler colonialism has wrought. I want you to have a 10-second think. When and how did you learn that you belong to something called a race? When did you learn that you were white, or that you were black, or that you were biracial, that you were Asian? Whatever you identify as. when did you learn that? And I would be willing to wager that for some of us, we knew very early on, and others were able to live years of your lives, decades even, without ever really thinking about where you fit, because you were just normal. But think about when you realized that you were a racial being. That's part of the socialization we receive in this country, and it's part of this social construction. But we didn't create the system, and yet we continue to perpetuate it in ways that we're not always aware of. And other people also get to weigh in on whether or not we belong to a certain community, even if we think that we do. So for example, I'll share, because I'm Afro-Latina, which is very confusing to a lot of people. I come from a country where Spanish is the main language, and so for people to hear me identify as Black is very confusing. But I'm also acknowledging that I have a history in my family of enslavement, and that history means that I have a tie to the African diaspora, and I'm Black, but I'm also Latina. And so this intersection, right, the meeting of all these separate identities I have as an immigrant, as a cis woman, as a person who speaks other languages, but also as an educated person, all of those are really complicated. So we don't always know where these ideas about race came from. We know that they happened a long time ago, and we don't own that construction, but we still live within it. We're still in the building that we didn't make. A little bit of historical context, because I did teach history. So here we go. The made-upness of race is so evident all throughout U.S. history, but I'm going to highlight two Supreme Court cases where it becomes very apparent that race is made up. In 1992, a Japanese-American man argued in the court that because his skin was pale, he was white, and therefore eligible to be a U.S. citizen. The Supreme Court ruled that whiteness only applied to members of the Caucasian race. 3 months later, another man, this time from India, living in the U.S., argued that because he was Caucasian from the region of the world called the Caucasus, he therefore was white and eligible for citizenship as well. And this time, the court turned around and said that though he was Caucasian, he was not white. So both of these men, a Japanese-American man and an Indian-American man, were denied U.S. citizenship on the basis that they were not white. And so whiteness has been denied to countless other people. Even though there are definitions in the law of what whiteness is, we know that there are also socially perpetuated definitions of how whiteness works. It's been denied to Asians, Pacific Islanders, and many others, and it's also been extended over time to different national and ethnic groups. And as Reese mentioned, and as others have mentioned as well, Irish Americans were at one point not considered white and then were, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, and many others. When we think about whiteness, there's also, it's not a static thing. It wasn't always defined one way. It changes. This is part of the sort of art of race, is that it's very adaptable. But nowadays, in general, it's not only race where we see other people trying to define for us where we belong and what rights we have or don't have or are entitled to. It happens along other lines as well. I'm thinking right now about how the Olympic Games have started off on this terrible foot where people are defining man and woman in very static binary ways according to quantums of a hormone, when really we know that they exist on a spectrum. Race and so many other categories of being have been really narrowly defined for the purposes of socially constructing identities and keeping power. That's one thing I know. The second thing I know is that racism is normalized in the U.S. I would like for someone to share, just shout really loudly. What kinds of things do you hear people say after the murder of an unarmed person of color?
They should have obeyed with the cops.
Okay, they should have done. Yeah, they should have done something else, right? They should have followed up. They have a criminal record, right? So this is a pattern.
They had
What
drugs
else?
in their system.
They were using drugs.
They were threatening and aggressive.
Right. So we know, right, that there are narratives that we use to justify these crimes. And one of the most common ones is, this isn't who we are. This is not who we are. But unfortunately, history is telling a different story. We know that over time, in the United States, there have been many different ways in which racism has been perpetuated. First, by the enslavement of African people, and then through settler colonialism, then through Jim Crow, through many interventions and imperialism in other countries in the world, and the list goes on and on. So we may not think that this is who America or the United States is, but in some ways, it is deeply embedded into the history that children need to learn so that they can confront some of these injustices. When we talk about CRT, we're saying it's not CRT itself, really. We're teaching kids that racism exists and how it exists, how it adapts over time, how it has looked in the past and how it might look now, and what they can do about it. This conversation around CRT is bigger than that, and this is one of those things. A third thing that I know is that not everyone experiences race or racism in the same way. So, like I said, race is constantly shape-shifting. So we see different groups being victimized. After 9/11, Muslim Americans couldn't catch a break. Even Sikh Americans, people believed to be by some Muslims, were coming under attack. There was violence. There was a narrative discourse about them being the enemy, about them being un-American. So we see that happen over the course of history. And that's unacceptable. Racism is also experienced differently by people with similar identities because of intersectionality. So as I mentioned, gender identity, immigration status, language, and even wealth, ability, so many of our identities impact the ways that racism show up in our lives. And sometimes we don't think we're affected by racism, and it might be because we're not on the hard end of it. What are some of the ways you identify other than your race? Who are you?
Woman.
Yes.
Disabled.
Thank you. Yes.
Non-binary.
Non-binary. Thank you. We have all of these other identities that we have, but that doesn't mean that every woman, every non-binary person, every neurodivergent person, every newcomer, every trans human, that they all experience their transness, their non-binariness, all of those things the same way. One of the tenets that I really want to maybe encourage us to think about is, how do we listen to the voices of people who have been marginalized to better understand their individual experiences, but also then to see patterns, and to better think about our own positions in the world and how we might be privileged by the systems we live in. And I think it's important for me to say that I have experiences that are unique. And so as a Black Latina, I have experiences where my Blackness was really highlighted for me and was really salient, and others where being Latina, my Latinidad, was really important. And all of those parts of me, that intersectionality that makes me exactly who I am, it's important for you to hear my story, because I'm not part of this community. If you don't know how I move through the world and how people read me in the world, especially because I'm not from Vermont, I don't have a long generational history here, then I won't know if you are ready to really welcome me. So when we talk about building community, again, it's about learning all of the ways that we show up in the world and how other people show up and attending to those. And thinking about what systems do we have here in St. Albans, or what institutions do we have that are maybe excluding, marginalizing, maybe unintentionally, but if we want to make this a more inclusive place, that needs to be part of our strategy. If we're telling the story of this country, we cannot tell it without talking about race. We would be telling a very abridged version of the story. And so, again, the argument about CRT isn't just about critical race theory, which is really a graduate level academic theory. It's about the discomfort that people don't want to experience for themselves, for their children, for their friends. And so, here we are. These 5 things I shared with you, that's CRT. They're the 5 tenets of CRT, and they're not doing harm. They're here to undo harm. And I appreciate you all taking that message to all of your friends. I want to leave you with this, and I just want you to think about it. You don't have to tell me. But what kind of community do you want St. Albans to be? And what are you willing to learn or unlearn to get us there? Thank you.
peace is gone, my Father, when peace is gone,
In our darkest hour, hope lingers on.